Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the Brookings Institution. Before I begin my remarks, I'd just like to say on behalf of the institution that we are thinking every moment about the challenges that Australia is facing with the wildfires that are impacting Australia in such a dramatic and negative way. And they are in our thoughts and in our prayers. As well, we also are focused on the passenger list of the aircraft that was lost in Iran 2 days ago. All of those souls are in our thoughts and in our prayers today. I'm John Allen. I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and we're very honored to have you with us. Happy New Year. We're very pleased this morning to welcome the Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, who is our distinguished guest and our great ally in helping to study the future of the United States Army, the Defense Department, and the challenges that we face in the security environment. Secretary McCarthy was confirmed last year by the U.S. Senate, and after having served in that capacity as an acting secretary for a number of months, he has now assumed the full responsibilities on all the matters relating to our great United States Army, to include the recruitment, the organization, training, and equipment, and the care of 1.4 million personnel, those of our active duty force, our Guard and Reserve, and of course, our important civilian counterparts as well within the department. His is one of the most important jobs in the United States government, ladies and gentlemen, and pivotal to keeping our nation safe and our people safe as well. He has been, for me, a dear friend for a long period of time, and it's always wonderful to welcome you, Mr. Secretary, to Brookings. He's a battle-hardened veteran of the Department of Defense, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a more dedicated public servant, a better professional, and a more loyal friend of the United States Army and our institution. I say that, of course, notwithstanding the outcome of the Army-Navy game this year, for which I think he would argue about responsibility. But his promotion to being the Secretary of the Army is a great plus for our country and for the Army. Now, with so many real and potential challenges on the horizon, our U.S. Army has no choice but to adapt to an increasingly uncertain future, a future of complex and evolving threats in an environment of increasingly technological sophistication, rapid change, and lethality. And that is especially true of today's topic, which is the Indo-Pacific region, although I know the Secretary is focused with laser-like clarity, not just on the Indo-Pacific, but the Middle East and North Africa and Europe and elsewhere, because the Army is, of course, a global force. But today, we will talk about the Indo-Pacific region. So to our program shortly, the Secretary will offer us some of his own remarks, and then we'll be joined on the stage by Brookings Senior Fellow Mike O'Hanlon. And they'll cover a wide array of topics, but primarily be oriented on the Indo-Pacific region. Once we've wrapped up that discussion, we'll go to Q&A, and of course, we're very much on the record this morning. So again, sir, we are really honored by your presence here at Brookings, and let me cede the floor to you now for your remarks. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, General Allen, for those overly gracious remarks, but it's great to see my old teammate, a mentor and dear friend. It's good to see you. Thank you. Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, thank you for extending the invite and welcoming me today. Obviously, among the best in the business. So it's great to be here at Brookings. Washington is a war of ideas. I'm especially looking forward to the discussion portion later in this session. The U.S. must maintain overmatch against our adversaries, and the Army is foundational to the Joint Forces' success in the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility. Our modernization focus, how we fight, what we fight with, and who we are, is in part driven by our new challenges and potential adversaries. We remain ironclad to the Army priorities of readiness, modernization, and reform. Our budget and investments remain aligned to our priorities. This alignment will increase lethality and the ability to operationally be dynamic. In this era of great power competition, China will emerge as America's strategic threat. Over 60% of the world's GDP flows through the Straits of Malacca, and China is militarizing the global commons. In order to commoditize life for its 1.1 billion people, China is increasingly relying on its Belt and Road Initiative. Having the U.S. Army in the region with modernized weaponry, nestled alongside our counterparts, changes the calculus and creates dilemmas for potential adversaries. Furthermore, having the U.S. Army in the region strengthens America's position to conduct global commerce, build confidence with investors, and compete economically. The Army has traditionally focused its efforts towards Europe, given that Russia is a land-based threat. 7 decades of partnership in Europe have set the conditions for strong militaries and strong partners that are capable of countering threats from abroad. We will continue to provide deterrence and shaping operations in concert with our allies and partners in Europe. While many people think of the Army as primarily having a role in Europe, and we are doing many great things to bolster our capabilities in Europe, the Army is much more than tanks and Bradleys. We serve as the operational, command and control, advise and assist, long-range precision fires and effects, and the logistical backbone of our current and future military operations. The U.S. Army, in essence, is engaging in warfare by other means. As we learned during World War II, the adversary's goals and tyranny of geography will require the Army to operate on two fronts, both in Europe and Pacific. At first blush, it is easy to assume, based on landmass, the waterways in the Indo-Pacific would be predominantly a sister service endeavor. However, it will be the Army on the ground, partnered with militaries, influencing the people and serving as the ultimate deterrence. Pairing with our allies and partners, continuous presence, and shared equipment will enable military strength to overcome economic strangleholds, promote good global commons, and offer an alternative to the adversary's narrative. People don't live on water, air, or in space. Long before conditions escalate to war, there will be a battle of ideas. This is warfare by other means, and decisions will occur in the heart of the people. We must be present to offer an alternative. Churchill once remarked, quote, "There is only one thing worse than fighting with our allies, and that is fighting without them." In this competition space, our forces will require a change in behavior and patience. We must be engaged in constant competition versus an episodic engagement strategy. We are playing, as Simon Sinek would argue, an infinite game across several areas of responsibility. To engage with a finite mindset would have the Army measuring the wrong metrics, playing a different set of rules for a different game. The military has had a boxer's mentality to conflict. Go in, fast hands, and deliver a devastating punch in the first round. Fast, lethal, and gone. Our approach to competition with potential adversaries, however, such as Russia, China, will feel more like a soccer match instead of a one round in the ring. Endurance, strong partnerships, and patience will be the necessary mix. Presence does not have to lead to conflict. If we wait until there's a conflict, we are already too late. Right now, during the compete phase, the Army is refining our approach to improve our strategic readiness. We will accomplish readiness through strengthening our partnerships and advising and assisting with our regionally aligned Security of Force Assistance Brigades, known as SFABs, which will deploy in fiscal year 21. Our multi-domain task forces, with deployments in fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, will build partnerships. We seek to increase foreign military sales, international military education and training, and more repetitions from multinational exercises. Shared equipment, shared training, and shared understanding is the end state. The Army is reinvigorating our presence and disposition in the Pacific. History has shown the Army has always had a role in the Pacific. Just a quick glance back to MacArthur and World War II demonstrates the propensity for an adversarial land and resource grab in the region, and the subsequent challenges the tyranny of distance presents. The Indo-Pacific is strategically important to the United States for many reasons. We are an Indo-Pacific country. The world's 4 most populous countries and 3 largest economies are located in the region. 6 of the 10 largest armies in the world are located there. The U.S. maintains 5 bilateral treaties, all critical for our national security and prosperity. Forces in the region reinforce the American alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. In order to be competitive and gain an advantage, we must have continuous presence. In order to maintain overmatch and prevent conflict in the region, the U.S. Army must be postured in the region for the intensifying competition and, if required, to win in conflict. There is an ongoing fight for influence in the region, for which access and presence are critical. Partners matter. But the type of partner is paramount. China uses coercive economics, and many partner with them out of necessity. And in this lies a great deal of vulnerability. The Army partnerships comes with its modern and interoperable equipment, training on a continuous basis, and a commitment should deterrence fail, a present partner and the world's best fighting force. China may be the partner of coercion, but the U.S. Army is the partner of choice. The Army is uniquely suited to provide persistent presence and show commitment. Ships sail through shared waters, and planes fly overhead. These are integral parts of the fight, but nothing comes close to the effects of boots on the ground, standing shoulder to shoulder with our counterparts, huddled over plans, or walking through jungles together. This presence reinforces the United States' enduring commitment to our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. For example, in 2020, the Army is sending forces on 5-month-long extended rotations to Thailand, Philippines, and even Papua New Guinea. We are not only providing persistent presence and coordination with our allies and partners, we're also expanding the scope, duration, scale, and locations of our training and exercises with partners to push into new areas. The Army's National Guard State Partnership Program ties states to 78 different countries around the world that have routine and consistent touch points with each other. U.S. forces engage with 22 countries in Europe and 12 in the Indo-Pacific on a habitual basis. In many countries throughout the regions, armies are the largest and most influential military service, making the U.S. Army the logical partner of the services. Our Army-to-Army partnerships build valuable relationships for the DoD at large. These are more than simply steadfast partners. These are key decision makers and influencers in their respective countries. Furthermore, shared equipment builds interoperability and makes operating together easier while creating strategic depth. Our operations in the Indo-Pacific include training with Army forces, helping Thailand stand up their new Stryker units as their Stryker vehicles, 15 in fact, are arriving right now. The Philippines has asked for more help in training 72 infantry battalions as they upgrade their equipment and evolve their doctrine. While we continue to do traditional security cooperation, we're also employing new capabilities and using the Indo-Pacific as grounds to test our new concept known as multi-domain operations, or MDO. If conflict with a great power competitor occurred, the United States would be unable to easily bomb strategic locations and safely flow in forces. Seeking to regain overmatch and a solution for converging all domains, MDO creates an asymmetrical advantage. MDO sets the conditions in theater while opening a window for the joint force. In FY18, just months after the National Defense Strategy was published, reorienting our focus towards the great power competition with China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, we conducted our first experiments with the multi-domain task force. Intelligence, information, cyber, electronic warfare, and space units known as the I2Qs. In FY19, we tested MDO concepts, leveraging exercises such as Exercise Orient Shield with Japanese ground self-defense forces operating in the East China Sea. With its headquarters in Japan, the task force elements were distributed across the Senkaku Islands. Pacific Pathways tested our ability to use a hub-and-spoke model, deploying task forces to single locations for a longer period of time, and executing dynamic force employment to spoke locations. We deployed a company from a hub locations in the Philippines to Palau, returning after 37 years. We are invigorating historic partnerships through our partner forces. In FY20, we plan to conduct Defender 2020, incorporating long-range precision fires and long-range precision effects. By FY21, the Army will position a multi-domain task force in the Indo-Pacific theater and deploy a second one in FY22. This is inspiring our closest allies and partners to invest more in building similar capabilities. Japan, Thailand, Singapore, all are developing MDO-like concepts in concert with us. It also provides the opportunity to stretch the limits of logistics and learn how to employ new capabilities in different operational environments. Exercise in new locations to experiment with distributed logistic concepts and develop methodology for employing long-range precision fires or hypersonics in the region. The U.S. Army, on contentious ground, creates a continuous dilemma for potential adversaries and changes the calculus in their decision-making cycle. We remain steadfast in our commitment to the Army priorities, and our budget and investments are aligned against the same. Forces such as regionally aligned SFABs and MDTFs generate options for commanders ranging from influence to direct contact. Furthermore, MDO creates strong and integrated partners in the region. The U.S. must maintain overmatch against our adversaries, and the Army is foundational to joint forces' success in the Indo-Pacific area of responsibility. General Allen, Mike, thank you for having me. As you know, I'm a big fan of all of your work. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for those fantastic remarks, for joining us again at Brookings. I want to give my own little shout out, not a full introduction, but I was just recently at a conference with our good friend Mackenzie Eaglin from AEI, who was recounting a lot of the accomplishments that you and the other members of the so-called Big Four, General McConville, now Army Chief, and then your predecessors in these jobs, Secretary Esper, General Milley, the so-called concept of night court, where, to back up all the beautiful words you just heard, these folks got into the trenches and went through program by program the Army's budget for modernization and many other things, and actually modified or canceled, I believe, somewhere in the range of 180 programs, saving $5 to $10 billion a year. So I know there are a lot of people who are worried the defense budget's going up too much, and we can debate that. Probably not today so much, but that's a national question. There are people who worry that we're too focused on this or that priority. What I want you to know is the Big Four rolled up their sleeves with a title that's fitting of almost a Netflix TV show, Night Court, and went through pound by pound, dollar by dollar. $10 million was not too small of a program to re-examine, and as a result, the Army has $5 billion a year or more to back up these priorities that you've been talking about: hypersonics, AI, cyber weapons, directed energy weapons. So congratulations on all of that as well, and on your new position. I wanted to begin really by asking you to explain two big concepts about the Indo-Pacific before we get into sort of more nitty-gritty, country by country and program by program. And one is to just define the Indo-Pacific for C-SPAN audiences and others who may not know just how the Department of Defense uses that term. And then second, to explain to what extent the U.S. Army has the same view as the Department of Defense writ large, because in the DoD Indo-Pacific strategy of last year, you collectively talk about the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region as the most important in the entire world for American defense policy. And yet, as you said in your remarks, historically we've worried a lot about Russia, the Soviet Union, the threat to Europe. And it looks to me as if for the Army, Europe remains a comparably important priority. And of course, the Middle East remains the area of greatest activity. So how do we understand the role of the Army in the Indo-Pacific, and to what extent is it really your priority theater compared to these other two? So if you could just maybe give us some broad context about those two questions, and then we can move on, please.
Sure. I guess let's start from the broader Indo-Pacific. Secretary Mattis, when he assumed the role, was looking more comprehensively of how to look at that problem set, and recognizing that you got to go all the way through Southwest Asia and have a comprehensive view of allies and partners and how it influences the region. So that's where historically the PACOM is what we would call it, the Pacific Command, would basically end roughly just shy of going west of the South China Sea. And it's where, so Secretary Mattis extended that and had a much broader view to looking at all of the relationships and within the area of responsibility. So he expanded that, because if you kind of looked at the gray area where CENTCOM and PACOM meet, we didn't have enough focus and energy against the purity of Southwest Asia once you went east of Pakistan, per se.
Yep.
So from a military standpoint. So that's where we extended the Indo-Pacific and have a much broader view. With respect to, I'm sorry, the second question
well,
was...
just for the Army, is it really fair to say that this is the priority region? For DOD writ large, for the Air Force and Navy, one can understand the argument. But for the Army, it looks like you've got more forces in Europe than you do in Asia, and you've got more activity, more kinetic activity in the Middle East. So it looks to me like the Army has three regions.
This is where it's, I guess I would call it the accounting within for combatant commanders. There are more assigned forces to Indo-PACOM for the U.S. Army than any other theater. The challenge is a lot of them are in Washington State and the west coast of the United States.
Right.
So what challenges the Indo-PACOM commander is the disposition of the capabilities. So when back in the spring, General McConville, my wingman, and I, we actually went out to see Admiral Davidson, spent 2-3 days with him, took a look at our investments, our emergency deployment readiness exercise program, our Defender program, to look at how the disposition of the capability would better serve his needs to get the effects within the region. So we expanded the EDRI program, put more money in there. We put more money in the Defender series program, and I highlighted that in my remarks before. That's basically a division-size element, CONUS-based unit that's not assigned to the theater. So say the 1st Cavalry Division or somebody will send to the Pacific, and you could drop them in. They could start in Thailand, bounce to the Philippines, go to Palau, and they'll do dynamic force employment hub-spoke model. So we put more funding in there so we could do more of these exercises, have more of the capability for him to move the forces around dynamically and work with partners within the region. So so when you look at it from that standpoint, there's a lot of capability there, but the rigid nature of the systems, the way they're accounted and allocated, it's providing more flexibility for the Indo-PACOM commander. You did highlight the stress of the job. We're 182,000 people and rising in over 140 countries. We're everywhere.
Yep.
And comes with that is a tenuous balance to make sure that we can support all of these combatant commanders. You mentioned the Night Court exercise. That's what happens when middle-aged men get to brand something, right? It's a TV show from the 80s. And they did that. The Army staff has a sense of humor, because the 4 of us sat at the end of the table, and you had to go in and try to get your program funded, and we'd riddle them with questions like the Supreme Court, and you'd either get one of these. But we had to find the funding. You mentioned the challenges with increases in defense spending and the country's in debt. We need to be better public servants with every penny that they give us, and that's what we tried to do. So when you have 180,000 people deployed, over 60% of your balance sheet is fixed, operations and maintenance and military personnel, pay people. So you have 40% of your budget for research, development, and acquisition. You had to make hard choices within there for your present and your future. And we did that. We made some really big bets, and we're going to see how we did here in the next 18 months.
So fantastic, because I think what you're driving at, and please, embellish or correct me if I'm wrong, if we look at the U.S. Army foreign basing in the Indo-Pacific, it's really only large in South Korea. There's no other place where we have many thousands of forces all the time. But what you're talking about is emphasizing more Southeast Asia and then South Asia, all the way over to the India-Pakistan border where Central Command takes over, and then having enough flexibility, capability, available funding to move forces around on more temporary deployments, partnerships, exercises, all the full range of activities. And you're thinking, as you said, Thailand, many of the South Pacific island nations, Vietnam. We'll come to all these in a second, but that's really where your emphasis has been. Is that fair to say in broad terms?
You have a much more comprehensive disposition in the region. Yes.
I want to ask about military readiness in a broad sense. I know that with your responsibilities as Secretary of the Army, you're focused first and foremost on making sure the force is fully equipped with proper weaponry, proper training, good maintenance, the right people. And then you apply that, and combatant commanders and forward commanders exercise and use the capabilities that you've provided them. But you have to keep an eye on the way in which deployments to Afghanistan, deployments to Iraq, deployments to Europe and Korea, and all these others might provide too much wear and tear on the force. And we've heard concerns over the years, the Army's, fraying at the seams, it's being asked to do too much. Are you concerned that the Army, in all of its efforts to maintain previous commitments and now add these new sorts of things, is undergoing readiness strain that's of a serious and concerning nature? Or do you feel like you've got the balance in pretty good shape these days?
So, great question. It's the one among those that make you wake up at night. In the last 3 years, we've gone from 2 brigades to 26 at their highest levels of readiness. And that's as much funding as it is extraordinary leadership of people like Mark Milley and Jim McConville and Mike Garrett down at Forces Command, of just laser focus on the training plans, and I met Abe Abrams, who's now in Korea, but the laser focus on training plans and leadership. If you were to talk to Jim McConville or a battalion commander in the 82nd, they sound the same. They know what they have to do, and they're laser focused on those plans and getting their repetitions and getting soldiers ready to go. So very proud about that. The aspects of tactical readiness, you got to shoot, you got to move, and you got to communicate. It's the simple fundamentals, whether it's an individual or a squad. So one of the things that we're looking really hard at is you just really focus on the fundamentals. If you're Bear Bryant, you got to block and tackle in football. We got to block and tackle in the Army. And so a lot of focus on the simple fundamentals. But this year, like I highlighted in my remarks, it'll be a lot about strategic readiness, force projection. Can you call people on New Year's Eve and have them boots on the ground the next day in the Middle East? U.S. Army can, because we did it a week ago. Very proud of that, very proud of 1st Brigade of the 82nd. But we got to do that with everybody. So we looked very hard at investments for strategic force projection, and we're going to continue to make those adjustments with readiness over time. We've been at war for over 18 years, and the strains are there. People are tired, but we're an extraordinarily resilient bunch, and we're trying to make some tweaks within the training model so they can get more heads on their nights on the pillow. So it takes a lot of effort, but it's going to be tough right now. Demand is as high as it could be.
I want to get back to the main focus of more southern parts of the region and more western parts of the region in a second, but one readiness question about Korea, if I could, just because I think it's so important for us to keep our eye on this, and I know you agree with me. Last spring, when General Dunford, who was still then chairman, came to Brookings, I asked him, are you concerned about readiness in Korea for Army and other forces because we've stopped doing the big exercises in an effort to try to facilitate a dialogue with Kim Jong-un and potentially a nuclear deal? And by the way, I've supported the suspension of large exercises, but that's neither here nor there. The question is, in an objective sense, from your point of view, I realize it's a better question perhaps for General Abrams, but we've got you here, so I'd like to, as Secretary of the Army, how do you feel about the readiness of U.S. forces in Korea and those that would go to Korea early in a conflict from the United States or elsewhere, given that we've stopped for the moment doing these big exercises as we traditionally had done with the Republic of Korea armed forces?
So I'm heading to South Korea at the end of the month, and I'll get a great chance to sit down with General Abrams and get a much greater perspective Like he had said he has managed the risk. The CONUS-based units and they're ready to roll. We've done a remarkable job there, as I highlighted before, 26 brigades at the highest levels of readiness. So, but for efforts on the ground, General Abrams is making adjustments, and he thinks he can manage the risk.
So you see it as a risk, but a risk that at the moment is, if it's causing any degradation in capability at all, it's at a very modest level and one that we can figure ways around.
Yes.
Well, let me get more now towards the regions that you were focused on in your remarks, the broader part of this whole, I think it's more than half of the world's surface in the Indo-Pacific Command, if I'm not mistaken. And if we count the entire Pacific Ocean, much of Asia, all the way over to the Indo-Pakistani border. Could we start with the Philippines? And I'd just love to ask about your overall sense of that relationship, the most important things the Army is doing, and then where some of your plans are headed with the Philippines going forward.
A very strong historic relationship, obviously dating back to the 40s. And so I'm actually traveling there at the end of the month, and we're looking we have about 5 different locations that we're in partnership with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Act, building out those locations so we can do advise and assist work together. We had a Stryker Brigade go through there back in the spring and train together. We're looking at some other additional investments in the Philippines. Our mill-to-mill relationships are very strong and something that we work very hard at.
Would you describe that relationship as it's been, I think, primarily, of course, it was the early 90s when we left the big military bases and they closed down and we changed the nature of the relationship with the Philippines. And then after 9/11, we started doing training for their own problem with jihadists on their own territory in Mindanao. Is that still the main focus of the relationship, or do you see this, even from an Army perspective, as focused largely on China and broader changes in the region?
No, I think it's definitely expanded for us. We have a great relationship. Our Army Special Forces have been training with them for a very long time. They have great relationships with all the leaders in their government. But it is expanding to the conventional side, and that's part of my agenda when I head there at the end of the month.
Let me I want to talk about Indonesia and maybe Thailand and a couple of others as well before we go to the audience pretty quickly here. But let me ask about, more generally, about how armies in the region are thinking about China and how they therefore think about working with you, working with the United States. There's a lot of concern that China is sort of eating our lunch in Asia, that they have the biggest economic relationships with everybody now, our biggest trade relationships, that they have the Belt and Road Initiative, as you pointed out, that sort of helps them buy friends, and that sometimes our popularity, one place or another under one president or another, suffers from a perception that we're too unilateralist or what have you. But what do you see when you're talking to the armies in the Philippines or Indonesia or Thailand or Vietnam, for that matter? What's their view? How do they think about the U.S. versus China? Are they trying to balance one against the other? They want to have good relations with both. Are they afraid of China, even if they don't always say so publicly? What's your takeaway?
So, it's in many cases it's very bilateral. It's hard to work trilateral and multilateral relationships, but it's an insatiable appetite to partner with the United States. Whether it's foreign military sales or advise and assist, they want us there, and but more so than anything is just to see the consistency and to stay and have the continuous presence. And so it's something that we have to make sure that can transcend across administrations, no matter who's president.
Yep. One thing I noticed, the tone of the Indo-Pacific strategy and of your remarks, and I say this with admiration, it's not very focused on war making. I mean, obviously you're worried about that. You're always thinking about the possibility of conflict. But there's a lot of talk that even an old Peace Corps volunteer like me could applaud in sort of diplo-speak. You're trying to build relationships, you're trying to build partnerships, you're trying to find ways to collaborate on humanitarian assistance and relief missions and peacekeeping operations. Do you see the Army as sort of doing, in many ways, the more softer side of security, while the Air Force and the Navy focus on the potential big fight against China, as they sometimes emphasize these days, whereas the Army is sort of more in the relationship building business? I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying, but that sort of comes out of, if you read the Indo-Pacific strategy, most of the big modernization and lethality investments are Air Force and Navy. Most of the partnership investments are more on the Army side. How should I think of that?
Well, it's hard to partner from 500 feet under the water or 30,000 feet in a supersonic fighter airplane. I was at a dignified transfer at 3 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, so we are not the Peace Corps up at Dover Air Force Base. Yep. But Army is a people business. And we bring the advantage of being shoulder to shoulder with an ally, where you eat a slice of pizza, you get to know their kids. And yes, and you train together, and ultimately, if you have to, you're going to fight together. But that's the nature and extraordinary value that the Army brings to a partnership. You get to know each other, you get to help each other. Iron sharpens iron. So the value of that is, it's hard to evaluate, but that's why it's so unique about putting American boots on the ground anywhere in the world.
Let me ask, I'm going to go to the audience pretty quickly, but let me ask about if there's any country of the ones we've already mentioned, or India also needs to be part of this conversation, that you're particularly excited about some of the new dynamics that you see happening, that the new opportunities for closer collaboration, the new capabilities that are being built bilaterally or in some other way. Maybe there are one or two countries that you think need to get a little more of a shout out or need more attention because there are just dynamic things happening that hadn't been before.
Well, it's like I highlighted in the remarks. Immediately when the average, observer looks at the Indo-Pacific region, they just view us as in Korea. And we have thousands of people. Thailand, the Philippines, we're everywhere. And it's of them understanding, having the appreciation for just how much we are doing, how much more we're going to do in that part of the world. So it is a challenge, and it's just, you have to get out and highlight the fact.
One last question, and then we'll go to others who I know have a lot to ask you about as well. I threw out the Peace Corps metaphor a minute ago. Let me now switch over to the more long-term dire scenario of a worsening relationship with China that, heaven forbid, it come to pass. But if we wind up in a more rivalrous state, are you thinking long-term about ways in which the U.S. Army might more permanently establish combat power throughout the broader region? I'm thinking of bases that perhaps are primarily Air Force or Navy, but where the Army has a huge role in providing missile defense, long-range fires. Now that we're out of the INF treaty, perhaps surface-to-surface missile batteries. You alluded to hypersonics in your remarks as well. This could be in the Philippine archipelago. This could be in other South Asian or South Pacific nation archipelagos. It could be in Vietnam someday. I'm just wondering to what extent the Army is thinking about these kinds of possibilities in the abstract. I realize you don't want to get ahead of the game and start asking countries to base forces where those countries are trying to balance their own relationship with China. But in a more abstract, general sense, are you thinking about, what Andy Krepenevich calls archipelago defense? Are you thinking about new kinds of combat formations throughout this broader region that, if necessary, we could establish and sustain?
So I highlighted the multi-domain task force concept, and to do it justice, you would need far more time to sit here and discuss, but and ultimately bring experts like General LeCamera out in U.S. Army Pacific and others. But a multi-domain task force brings long-range precision fires and effects. So a hypersonic battery, the precision strike missile, which is the ATACMS replacement, electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, and the disposition of the capability, Senkakus, Ryukus, you could put it down somewhere in the South China Sea, and those have the effects to change anti-access area denial type of capability. So it basically has the inverse effects. And then what it can do is become a ground seed element, suppressing enemy air defenses. So that then can flow in ships or airplanes or other, along with being a deterrent, which is the ultimate goal. We don't need any more gunfights. We don't want any more. But if they come, we'll be ready.
Thank you. Well, let's go to you. Please wait for a microphone and identify yourself if you could. And we'll start here in the fifth row, Adam, this gentleman here. Thank you.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. Thanks for being here, Mr. Secretary. You mentioned FMS sales in your remarks. Can you talk about, some types of specific capabilities or systems that you want to encourage U.S. allies in the Pacific to invest in and buy U.S. equipment?
Well, any and all to start with, but Thailand has purchased 60 Strikers. They've got the first 15. We're going to flow the rest here shortly. Chinook helicopter sales. We're selling a lot of small arms capabilities, communications. If you look at major platforms, but communication is also very important as well. That's where the interoperability comes, and we can be able to communicate with each other and coordinate large entities to conduct exercises. So every time I meet with an ally, FMS sales is on the agenda. I do everything I can to help push American business all over the world.
Sydney.
Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Just before we started here, I Googled an old article of mine entitled "Pivot to Asia Not So Fast" about the lingering gravity of the Middle East. That was from 2012. So people have been trying very hard across two administrations in both parties to focus all of DOD, let alone the Army, on the Asia Pacific, and the Middle East, keeps on sucking us back in. Obviously, you're not the guy who allocates forces. That's a joint staff function. But as you look at the Army modernization program, as you do the night courts and the budget plus-ups and the 31 priority programs, how can you make sure that the things you're investing in have applicability to across the theaters you're working in, that the capabilities in the Big Six and so forth have a role in the Mideast and in the Pacific and in the European theater, rather than being custom niche for one theater the way a lot of the Big Five were back in the 80s?
So you need a couple of things. Number one, you need the will to do it, and we do have the will. The second was, to the points that Michael talked about earlier, was the balance sheet engineering called Night Court. We freed up billions of dollars. Now, the preponderance of it went towards modernizing our force. But we also freed up hundreds of millions of dollars so we could have a Defender exercise, so we could have a more robust EDRI program. And now we're in a position to put thousands of people in the region. And we did that. And we've started over 2 years ago, so we have been doing that, and it's really starting to scale here in 21. So you have to be able to balance all of the worldwide demand. That's a very hard thing to do that the Secretary of Defense Esper is doing a great job on. But he's got to be reliant upon the services to make hard choices and create that trade space in their balance sheets so they can do it all. In the Army's case, we've done that. And we're going to have thousands of people in Indo-PACOM training this year.
Let me take the prerogative to just follow up on Sydney's point and just put this question to you directly. Is there any area, any activity where the recent need to put more forces in the Middle East has deprived you of the opportunity or the resources to focus more on great power competition the way the National Defense Strategy says we must? Or are you able, so far at least, to manage all of that simultaneously?
So it has undoubtedly forced me to take a harder look, make some adjustments, but right now we're still on track with all of our commitments to our allies and partners from both of those AORs.
See, ma'am, over here on the side, and then we'll come back here to the second row in a second.
Thank you. I'm Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Thank you, Secretary. The Army does make a big difference on the ground. I would like to come back to the Vietnam War and wonder how you prepare to deal with the public relations in the Southeast Asia, especially now in the Philippines under Duterte. What if there are efforts to somehow create conflicts between our American armies and the people there in the Philippines by causing a lot of chaotic situations like what happened in Vietnam under President Ngô and also other in the long term. You said we have the will, but would the will of the people of America be what's going down if we're not under the support of Congress? So the second question is, what do you think about the role of Congress in supporting your role? Thank you.
The role of Congress is critical for everything that we do in the U.S. Army because the American people send them there. They're elected, I'm appointed. So they're my board of directors, and they're the pulse for where the country is. So it's incredibly important for us to work with Congress. I talk to congressional members and staff, I think, just about every day. So with respect to the Vietnam conflict, as the son of a Vietnam veteran, I am intimately aware of the aspects of that conflict, growing up at the kitchen table and hearing about it. So it is as important to have everything right here at home as it is to work with the partners. And like I mentioned in my remarks, the types of things we're doing with allies is as much training and assisting as investing in those countries to strengthen their partnership economically, militarily. So it's all of the things we can do to prevent conflict.
I'm going to, again, intercede and just ask one quick question because the question also touched on President Duterte, and it makes me wonder, some of the countries you are working with in this region are of mixed democratic credentials, to put it politely, and that's an age-old problem. It's not new to this region or to you and the Trump administration, but I wondered, are there any places particularly where you have to really keep your eye on the country's human rights record or recent proclivity for military takeover or anything else where that's been a big constraint and concern on your partnership and engagement activities?
It makes a big challenge for us, and I'm not going to highlight anybody specifically. We are not going to allow our values as a service or as a country be dragged down by instances like that. But we do want to stay close to the institutions that we've partnered with for decades. Countries have challenges politically. They go up and they go down. And, when you look at relationships that withstand the test of time, the best relationship that the U.S. government has with a country like Egypt or others, it's the U.S. Army. We train together. They buy our equipment. They come back in force. Some of them send their kids to go to school here, to college and others. So you got to hang in there with them. You can dial up the relationship and bring it down while those challenges are in place. And I've seen many instances like that serving in the last 3 administrations. And you have to be conscious of it at all times. Thank you.
Here in the second row, please.
Brian McCullough from Lockheed Martin. Sir, thank you very much for your time. Attacks in Iraq this week show importance of missile defense. Vladimir Putin this week in Crimea with units that have hypersonic missiles. The Chinese last October showing the DF-17 at their great military parade. How do you see the Army taking on hypersonic defense requirements and approaches moving forward as part of your Indo-Pacific approach? Thank you.
We have a joint partnership across the entire Department of Defense between Navy, Air Force, and Missile Defense Agency on the hypersonic effort. We're investing billions of dollars across this future years defense plan. We're actually looking at even increasing the profile over the next couple budgets. So this has been basically been a national priority since Secretary Mattis was in the seat. The President has vested a lot of attention against this as well, in particular. So the resources there's tremendous energy there. What we need to see is industry to step up and invest. And they've got to come forward and, first and foremost, invest the time to work with our national lab network to understand how we've come forward with this technology. But they're going to have to make investments to be able to produce these at scale.
I'm going to do it again because people keep asking such great questions and raising topics that I think invite follow-on questions. We talk a lot about hypersonics these days, and I wondered, Mr. Secretary, if you could explain a little bit more what specific problem they are trying to solve at an offensive level. So there's the missile defense question, but there's also The question I sometimes think that as important as these weapons are, and as happy as I am that you're investing more in them, they're always going to be somewhat exquisite weapons. They're complex, they're expensive, and what they do is they reduce the time from launch to detonation or impact. But often we're pretty fast already at shooting weapons once we know what we're shooting at, once we have the target. So what specific set of problems do hypersonics allow you to solve at an offensive level that you couldn't address with other kinds of weapons? Just how important is this area of military innovation?
I would, what I've done repeatedly, hypersonics is like the Pershing missile of the 21st century. If you look at what the Pershing missile did in Europe, unfortunately they never had to fire one. There were about 3 battalions arrayed around Europe, and it was a tremendous deterrent for conflict, and that's obviously the optimal use for that capability. But it's because of the extraordinary speed and lethality of that capability. The dilemma is that if you don't have essentially the type of almost artificial intelligence-like capabilities because of the speed at which the munition can travel, you can't find it, sense it, or shoot it because it'll be there within a couple minutes. And that's what has got so much attention from national leaders like the ones mentioned because of its extraordinary capability. And it could send a very strong message, or it could confuse people too, and you could end up in an escalatory type of situation. So from an offensive standpoint, it creates dilemmas that would disrupt any decision cycle. From a missile defense standpoint, it is as much of the hardware as it is the sensing capability of just how fast can you find it, and then cue something to kill it. So this is an extraordinary capability that a lot of countries are investing enormous national resources against, and is going to change warfare.
Thank you. Woman here in the red jacket in the 4th row.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, hello. My name is Bonnie Gerard, and I'm president of a consultancy. Don't let the name worry you. It's China Channel Limited. We're a risk and strategic advisory consultancy originating out of Beijing originally in 1996 and then out of the States since 2001. My question is this. You talked a few minutes ago about partner armies in the U.S. Army getting to know each other by eating slices of pizza, getting to know each other's kids' names, being together. How, such as people like us, some are also from the commercial world, who've spent decades in China, we got to know by working and living and socializing side by side with active and retired PLA officers and their families. We got to know these people, and we had slices of pizza and chicken wings and other things. So we got to know them in a way that for the commercial world was appropriate. How does the Army get to know the Chinese PLA in a similar, intimate way?
The pizza was Freudian slip. It's Friday night in the McCarthy house. So, but the General Milley, who was the chief before and now the chairman, met with his PLA counterpart 2 or 3 times. And that is exactly the type of behaviors we've got to have. Frank, candid conversations, mill-to-mill relationships in particular. Now, I don't think it was, obviously from the political point in time, we should as well. But the mill-to-mill relationships are so unique because the continuity, it transcends administrations. I agree with you. We've done that with certain frequency on and off for the last couple decades at least. There needs to be more of it. I encourage it as well. I remember when I was working for Robert Gates, he and Admiral Mullen had a week-long event where they brought in all of the leaders from the PLA, and it was extremely beneficial. We just need to be more consistent with that because you have an understanding with each other. So no, I absolutely agree with you, and we should do more.
We'll go to the gentleman on the same side here, about 7th row back, Adam.
Secretary McCarthy, good to see you. Jonathan White from Bechtel. Regarding the stationing of forces in the Pacific, is there any effort to increase the permanent presence of forces at our legacy bases, or will you primarily focus on kind of expeditionary Pacific Pathways type presence? Thank you.
So I very much are in line with where Secretary Mattis started this, and Secretary Esper's right there as well, is the dynamic force employment, and it's expeditionary in nature. We can be much more comprehensive in the touch points in the region. It's much more economical, and as you know, speed counts. So it'll be dynamic, expeditionary nature for the foreseeable future.
I'll even give a brief shout out to Secretary Rumsfeld. He gets beaten up a lot over Iraq, but some of the origins of this thinking, I think, even go back to him. And so it's been an idea that's been in the works. You're able now to make it happen a little more than some of your predecessors. The woman here on this side on the sixth row.
Hi, I'm Soyeon Kim from Radio Free Asia. About North Korea, so do you think this growing conflict between the U.S. and Iran directly or indirectly affect to North Korea? Some prospects that North Korea might take advantage of this time when U.S. is more focused on Middle East area, and then they might take some more provocative action towards U.S. And the following question is there any new effort by U.S. Army in Korean Peninsula to step up more defense or offense capability against North Korea? Thank you.
Okay. With respect to your first question, there's always risk with that. I don't see a direct correlation right now. And on the operational side, I'm not going to comment about operational moves on the peninsula.
So we'll go to Tom, and then after him, the gentleman right next to Tom.
Good morning again, Mr. Secretary. Tom Burke. I'm an Army FEF here at Brookings. Sir, as a recent aviation brigade commander in the Indo-Pacific AOR, I can attest to the strategic the tactical through strategic benefits of the Pacific Pathways mission set. As you're looking to expand this mission set, is this something that you've considered doing in cooperation, for example, with the Marine Corps, just as we're looking to manage the multitude of commitments that we have in the Army? Thank you, sir.
Well, we all participate in the Pacific Pathways exercise, and this is where the Indo-Pacific commander and then our Army Pacific commander bring all the collective U.S. capabilities together with our partners out in the region. So it's a large multinational effort. The Marine Corps participates, has a substantial presence during that exercise. Some of the things that the Marine Corps are looking at is the disposition within the region as well. I don't think they've made any decisions at this point. Changes, excuse me.
Hi, Christopher Woody from Business Insider. Regarding logistics, the Army in Europe has been working with its partners, NATO and the EU, to rebuild its ability to resupply and reinforce. How satisfied are you of the Army's ability to resupply and reinforce across Indo-Pacific, and what do you need to do with sister branches and with partners in the region to improve that?
So, like I mentioned before, it's the tyranny of distance. Just to go, what's it, about 900 miles from just Vietnam to the Spratlys. So it's a haul to get anywhere. So the logistical points in the region, you're going to have to rely largely on your allies and the expeditionary nature. So where do you put pre-positioned equipment, expeditionary type locations that have runways or access to harbors? We've had great relationships for decades, and to Michael's point earlier, it's kind of re-energizing some of those muscles. That'll require investment, and it'll require some work with allies. And how do we partner together to do that? We've got some work to do.
By the way, on the North Korea question, if you don't mind my asking or following up, you mentioned twice that we now have 26 brigades in a top tier of readiness. Presumably that's part of the answer to the question, too, that even though you are needing to send a few hundred or a few thousand forces here and there to the broader Middle East, you still got more combat-capable brigade, punch at high levels of readiness than we've had in really decades in the United States.
It's
It's extraordinary considering the demands we face in the world, and it is truly a testament to the leadership of those men I mentioned before.
And that's 26 in the active force or across the entire?
Across of all of our brigade combat teams. We've got over almost 60 brigades on between the active Guard and Reserve. So, yeah.
So about half are top-tier readiness, and most of the rest are maybe a notch down, but still pretty good.
And the things that make you the most proud is we even within the last 18 months, we took an armor brigade that was not at the highest level of readiness, just hey you. They showed up and they delivered in the European theater, so to train in a large-scale exercise. So you can never underestimate just how good our people are. And even when they're just shy of going through the wickets, I bet on them every day and twice on Sunday.
And to reach that high level of readiness, you've got to have adequate numbers of people with the right technical specialties, the right training, the right equipment, and recent training experience and exercise experience. All those things have to be met to reach the top tier, right?
And they go through all those wickets, and if they don't, you're just dialing up the risk on their performance. But more often than not, they'll deliver even then.
Go here in the second row, and then one round in the back before we wrap up.
Hi, Dan Katz, currently unaffiliated. How do you see the Army's role in the region differing from that of the Marines, but then also how do you see the Army supporting the role of the Marines in the region?
So in many cases, we support the Marine Corps logistically with air assets and long-range precision fires. This is sustainable nature. Marine Corps can show up, hit hard, but then with having a duration within that deployment, that's where the challenge, because the logistical backbone is that I highlighted. So that's really where they do a lot of that together. They can do some other more offensive type training together as well.
So we had a couple of hands in the back before we wrap up here in about 5 minutes. So the gentleman standing, Adriana, right there, and then we'll work up.
Thank you, Secretary. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. You talk a lot about the competition between the U.S. and China. I'm wondering if there's still any cooperation with the PLA and the U.S. Army. I know last year there was a joint drill of the humanitarian rescue between the U.S. Army and PLA. Anything else? And secondly, how do you see the role of Taiwan in the U.S. Army's Indo-Pacific strategy? Is there any efforts between the U.S. Army and Taiwan to step up the cooperation when the Pentagon is supporting Taiwan? Thank you.
Like I mentioned before, we have what we call our chief talks between the chiefs of our services with our counterparts in the Chinese government. We don't have any joint exercises or anything of that nature. With respect to the relationship with Taiwan, they're an interoperability partner. They buy U.S. capability. We do advise and assist type training with them, and consistently work that relationship through the Indo-PACOM commander in the U.S. State Department.
2 years ago, I was invited to be on a panel with General Brooks on the Armies of the Pacific symposium that I think the U.S. Army had spearheaded and promoted. I think you still do that annually too, right? That kind of thing where there's a multilateral gathering where the Chinese are part of the conversation. You talk about humanitarian relief, things like that. There was a hand. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. My name is Dong-Yun Kim from Voice of America Korean Service. You talked about hub and spoke and the flexibility of sending troops in the region. And obviously, United States Force Korea is one of the largest component in the region. I was just wondering, do you look into any situation of United States Force Korea being part of it being redeployed in other urgent situation in the region? And also, do you see any?
You mean deployed off the peninsula to go other places?
The part of like brigades or Apache, brigades, for example, and also, do you see any a role of United States Force Korea? Now, traditionally, it was focused on North Korea deterrence, but do you see much more expanded role for United States Force Korea on competing against emerging threat like China?
No, they're focused on the peninsula. We have other formations and organizations throughout the region that work other relationships.
And then there was one more hand over here, and then we'll wrap up, if we could, please.
Hi, Matt Baynard, Defense Daily. So you've mentioned long-range precision fires and the way it could be applied in Indo-PACOM, but I was wondering about across the other 6 priorities, how is the Army thinking about future vertical lift, next-gen combat vehicle with regards to the region? Thanks.
Obviously, range is incredibly important for our aviation fleet. I was just in Texas yesterday, and the day before I was there, and we're looking at a potential suitor to replace the Black Hawk helicopter, for example. And if you look at the types of requirements we're putting on our systems, range is incredibly important, whether it's a ground vehicle or it's a helicopter, because the nature of combat and where it has continually progressed. Weapon systems are becoming more capable, more lethal. They have greater range. So fights are getting more expanded everywhere in the world, and that's where warfare will head in the foreseeable future.
Mr. Secretary, you covered so much ground. Thank you for all you've been doing for the last 3 years, for your new responsibilities, and for coming to visit us today at Brookings.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.